Hello! Today I'm going to teach you about stress because that's what I'm studying for one of my finals, or it's one of the lectures that's part of the class. So, in the psychology of stress and its treatment, there's something called the biopsychosocial model. Now, this basically says that when treating mental disorders and treating stress, you have to take into account the biological mechanisms, social influences, as well as psychological factors that might play a role in the patient's outcome. An example of what that is not is, for example, if it's an exclusively biological model, then that would be like prescribing people SSRIs for their depression or benzos for their anxiety without taking into account other factors that might be influencing the way that their disease manifests and just simply medicating them. So the reason as to why these different categories exist, like biology, society, and psychology, is because of this concept called dualism. And this was invented by the philosopher Descartes. Let me make sure that I'm spelling that right. Descartes. And he basically coined the idea that the mind is separate from the body. And that's why we have like psychiatric hospitals instead of why we have psych wards instead of them being, I'm lagging, my brain's lagging. Dualism is why we have separate treatments for psychological disorders rather than treating it like a physical disorder, because people view the treatment of the mind as separate from the body when the biopsychosocial model believes that shouldn't be the case. Okay, next. In the DSM, stress is categorized as a somatic symptom and related disorder. Related disorder. So this is what stress-induced mental illness is underneath. It's underneath somatic because stress has physical effects on the body. And the area that my class focuses on is the category of psychological factors impacting other medical conditions. So this is a subset underneath somatic symptoms and related disorders. The reason as to why there's this category is because stress impacts how disease progresses. So for example, in a study done, I forget the citation, but it was in my lecture slides, cancer patients that had a lot more existential stress had poor patient outcomes, and they ended up dying at faster rates compared to people that had a more positive outlook. So that kind of proves how distress can, to a certain extent, predict your survival rate. All right. Next, I think I'll just go over some of the common terms used in explaining stress. So first, obviously, we just have stress. And stress is what happens when the demands placed on you outweigh your capacity to deal with it or the resources at your disposal to deal with a stressor. So that's what happens when, that is what produces stress, capacity/resources. Next is obviously the stressor, which is just the stimulus that causes the stress. And then we have something called eustress, which is beneficial stress. Stress can be beneficial, for example, adrenaline to help you perform better in sports, or stress that encourages you to study. So in low doses, this is considered beneficial and constructive. There's also something somewhat related to eustress called hormetic stress. So these are low dose stressors that increase resilience. An example would be ice plunges, because it's still somewhat stressful on the body, but it does have some benefits to it. So yeah, there's hormetic stress and then there's eustress. And eustress is just the broad category that encapsulates hormetic stress. All right. There are also very real physical ramifications that stress can have on the body. For example, oh my God, that's wrong. Not ACL, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and early life stress, ELS. These can contribute to an overactive HPA axis. This HPA just being the hippocampus, pituitary, and adrenal gland. So that results in more cortisol and norepinephrine being released. In terms of like brain structure, the hippocampus has reduced volume, so memory becomes impacted. And there's also an overactive amygdala. I spelled that wrong. There's a Y. Oh no, amygdala, which leads to heightened threat perception. I don't know why my pen like erases things. Heightened threat perception. So you're just in a constant state of stress, which is not too good. Yeah, it's not too good. All right. Next. So there is also my notes are all over the place, so I'm trying to find like trying to figure out how to group things. All right. I'm gonna continue on the physical impacts of stress. There's something called an allostatic load that relates to stress. Now, an allostatic load is the wear and tear that your body incurs from trying to maintain homeostasis in the face of a lot of stressors. And this can actually lead to chronic disease development. And another biological mechanism that occurs when you're constantly stressed is the reduction in telomeres. Now, telomeres are the things at the end of chromosomes that help replicate cells. So the more telomeres you have, the lower your biological age will be because your cells replicate faster. But when you're chronically stressed, you have reduced telomeres, which means that you have an older biological age, so your body's unable to recover from things as fast. All right, there we go. Another interesting fact about stress's impact on the body is that it really suppresses your immune system. Cohen did a cold study where he infected people with a cold, like a virus, and people that were stressed had decreased immunity. No stress. People that were stressed had decreased immunity, and the cold that they did end up catching was a lot more severe, and they took a much longer time to recover from it. But if they were not as stressed in life, then the cold that they contracted had less severe symptoms, and they also recovered faster. So that's your sign to not be stressed, I guess. All right, I'm gonna go back to just random facts that were sprinkled throughout the lecture. I'm not really sure how to categorize them. All right, so the next kind of like subset of topics, the next subset of stress that our lecture talked about is the role that hierarchy plays in stress. So there's two main things underneath this. One is, I don't know how to spell his name, Robert Sapolsky. Baboon study. So what he did was he looked at male baboons in the wild and their hierarchies, and he found that male baboons that were in a higher social position. I'm not sure how social position works in the animal world. I'm not that interested in evolutionary biology, or evolutionary psychology, whatever category it falls under. But however way they measured it, he found that the higher a male baboon was in the social hierarchy or social pyramid, the less health issues that baboon had, whereas baboons that were lower on the social pyramid had a lot more health issues. I don't know what those health issues were, the lecture didn't specify, but that's just the broad idea. Next is Whitehall's human study, not baboons anymore. Is there two L's? Two L's. Whitehall's civil service study. So Whitehall looked at members of the British civil service, and he found that ranks play a large role in how many sick days a person takes. So if you had a higher rank, I guess, in the British civil service, you were less likely to get sick, and people that were more entry level took a lot more sick days. So that kind of indicates that stress makes you more likely to get sick, and yeah, both among animals and humans. All right. Another thing that was mentioned is something called the minority stress framework. Now, this essentially says that minorities are likely to be subject to more stressors in life because they're discriminated against, which means that they're more likely to get sick and have lower health outcomes compared to people in the majority in a society, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. All right, next, I'm just gonna go through all the different frameworks. So the minority stress framework was one. The second framework we talked about was the transactional model of stress. Sorry, I'm writing. Okay, so the transactional model of stress describes, I guess, our analysis of stress in two waves. The first wave is primary appraisal. It's the first thing that happens. It's essentially your interpretation of a stressor. So you kind of determine if something is, like, how big of a threat a stressor is, and that kind of determines the response. So that goes on to secondary appraisal, where it's essentially where you evaluate how much resources you have to dedicate to the stressor. And obviously, if during the primary appraisal stage you interpret the stressor to be very of great magnitude, then during the secondary appraisal you would dedicate more resources and stretch yourself a little bit more thin trying to grapple with the stressor. Right, so the third framework is the 3-stage physiological response. So this, oh, my hair's sticking out. This says that the progression of stress throughout the body occurs in 3 stages. The first is the alarm stage, where it's like fight or flight. You're first exposed to the stressor and you're trying to figure out how to deal with it. And next is resistance. And it's here during resistance where I'm assuming most of the allostatic load is incurred, because during the resistance phase, you're trying to draw on reserves and your resources to maintain the stress response. So I'm guessing that's where allostatic load happens. And then finally, you have exhaustion, where you've depleted all your resources and your immune system's weakened, and it's kind of the after effects of the adrenaline that you experienced during the onset of the stressor. All right. That was very heavy. Next, we're going to go on to the benefits. Not benefits, the way that you can cope with stress, or like the good part of the lecture, the happy part. All right. So it's separated into two categories. First is buffers against stress, things that can increase your resilience and decrease your likelihood to get stressed, I guess. So obviously, first is exercise. The lecture specifically said it helps regulate your emotions. Next is meditation. The lecture said that meditation is specifically defined as non-judgmental, present focus. Interpret that how you will. I don't know how to interpret it. And next is social support, because if you have more friends, I'm just assuming you're less stressed. Finally is spirituality. Because. Next. So, those are the 4 ways of buffering against stress. And next, if you are already stressed, there are several coping mechanisms. First is problem-focused coping. So, it is what it is. You just try to solve the problem. Next is emotion-focused coping, where you try and regulate your emotions and have a better response to stress. This can look like cognitive reframing, changing how you think to reduce negative thought patterns that might perpetuate stress. So cognitive reframing, and then cognitive flexibility, which is just like thinking big picture, is how it was described. And finally, we have relationship-focused coping, where you reach out to your friends, your family, to try and grapple with your stress. All right, that was it. I'm probably gonna make more of these because I have an exam. This is for my abnormal psychology class, and my exam is on April 30th. And I need to not bomb it because I bombed my last one, which was really bad. But yes, thank you. Farewell, farewell.